Thanks very much, Paul, for that introduction, and to everyone for coming along, and the RSA for organising this event. Well, what I want to do in this paper this evening is to lay out the latest scientific understanding of the task that humanity faces in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. One of the most striking features of the global warming debate is how with each advance in the science, the news keeps getting worse. Although temporarily slowed by the effects of the global financial crisis, the world's greenhouse gas emissions have been growing much faster than predicted in the 1990s. In addition to that, since around about year 2005, a number of scientific papers have described the likelihood of the climate system passing significant tipping points, small changes, beyond which the warming process is reinforced by positive feedback mechanisms. Well, the paleoclimate record shows that the Earth's climate often changes abruptly, flipping from one state to another, sometimes within a few years or a few decades. And it now seems almost certain that if it hasn't occurred already, within the next several years, enough warming will be locked into the Earth's climate system to set in train feedback processes that will overwhelm any attempts that we make to cut back on our carbon emissions. If this happens, we'll be powerless to stop the jump to a new climate on Earth, one much less sympathetic to life. The accelerating rate of melting of the Arctic sea ice has shocked the scientists studying it, with many believing that summer sea ice will disappear entirely within the next decade or so. Some expect it to be gone even sooner. For instance, Mark Cerise, director of the US National Snow and Ice Data Centre, has declared that, quote, Arctic ice is in its death spiral. The dark water surface that will replace the reflective white one in summer will absorb more solar radiation, setting off a positive feedback process of further warming. And this is expected to initiate a cascade of effects as the patch of warmth over the Arctic spreads in all directions, warming the surrounding oceans, melting the Siberian permafrost, and destabilising the Greenland ice sheet. In December 2007, after a summer that saw a dramatic decline in Arctic sea ice, NASA climate scientist Jay Zwally said, "The Arctic is often cited as the canary in the coal mine for climate warming. Now, as a sign of climate warming, the canary has died. It's time to start getting out of the coal mines." Another resorted to a biblical metaphor. Climate scientists have begun to feel like a bunch of Noahs. The world's top climate scientists are now ringing the alarm bells at a deafening volume because the time to act has virtually passed. Yet it's as if the frequency of the chime is beyond the threshold of human hearing. At the same time as the science is becoming more worrying, growth in the world's greenhouse gas emissions has been accelerating. In the 70s and 80s, global emissions of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels increased at about 2% per annum. In the 1990s, they fell to about 1% per annum. But in the 2000s, they grew to close to 3% per annum. At that rate, annual emissions would double every 25 years. While rates of growth of greenhouse gas emissions have fallen below 1% in rich countries, they have expanded enormously in developing countries, led of course by China, where fossil fuel emissions have grown in the early years of the 21st century and indeed up until last year by some 11 or 12% per annum, a phenomenal rate of growth of fossil emissions. In 2005, China accounted for 18% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. By 2030, China is expected to be responsible for 33%. Now, the Chinese government takes climate change seriously. much more so than the United States under the Bush administration, and arguably more so than the United States under the Obama administration. And the Chinese government has implemented a number of policies designed to cut the emissions intensity of the electricity sector and transport. But the sheer expansion of the economy is swamping all attempts at constraining growth of carbon pollution in that country. Rather than decarbonising, the world is in fact carbonising at an unprecedented rate. And it's doing so at precisely the time we know we have to stop it. The recession that arrived in late 2008 slowed and in some countries reversed growth in annual carbon emissions. But the volume of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has continued to rise. Just as reducing the flow rate of tap water doesn't stop the bath filling up, even if annual emissions stop dead around the world, the fact that most of past carbon emissions remain in the atmosphere for a very long time would mean that elevated global temperatures would persist for many centuries. In the 1990s, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, developed a number of scenarios to reflect future influences on emissions and associated warming. Of the half dozen or so main IPCC scenarios, the worst case scenario is known as A1FI, and you can see it, that red projection at the top there, on the right hand side. Now this A1FI scenario, the one that assumed the highest estimates of warming in the IPCC reports, so when you see those warming ranges reported in the newspapers, the one at the top, the very highest one, is the one associated with A1FI. And this scenario assumes strong rates of economic growth with continued high dependency on fossil fuel-based forms of energy over the next decades. In the mid-2000s, it began to become clear that the growth in global carbon emissions had risen so high that the world has shifted onto a path that is worse than the worst case scenario imagined by the IPCC. In its worst case scenario, the IPCC anticipated growth in carbon dioxide emissions of 2.5% per annum through to 2030. Yet we've seen that from around 2000, global emissions began growing at close to 3% per annum. So this is worse than the worst case scenario. And so that worst case should now be regarded as the most likely one in the absence of determined intervention. It's not only the dramatic increase in the growth rate of global emissions that's turning alarm into panic in the scientific community. Advances in climate science have made the future appear more grim than we imagined. In particular, anthropogenic warming is likely to disrupt the natural carbon cycle. Sorry, you just notice that actual emissions, these dotted ones at the top, exceeding the A1FI emissions, the red line at the top. Now, tonight is not the night to go into the details of how the global carbon cycle works, except to note that when we dig up and burn coal, over half of the carbon dioxide released is absorbed in land and ocean sinks. Vegetation and the oceans themselves absorb half of the extra carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere. The rest, the remainder, stays in the atmosphere, some of it for a very long time. A quarter of it will still be affecting the climate after 1,000 years, and 10% of it will still be having an influence on the Earth's climate after 100,000 years. It's a very, very long-lived gas. Through global warming, changes in atmospheric carbon alter the rate of absorption and release of carbon from natural sinks in the oceans and the land. Climate carbon cycle feedback mechanisms that come into play include the reduced ability of warmer ocean waters to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the decline in deep ocean mixing and thus the transport of carbon from the surface organisms which absorb it into the deep ocean. In addition, warming is expected to cause more deforestation through droughts, fires and high temperatures, which will inhibit plant growth, and scientists are particularly worried about the effects on the Amazon. Well, when ocean and land sinks take up less carbon, a greater proportion of the carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere by humans stays there, strengthening feedback effects and causing more warming. Perhaps most worrying, the threshold for release of methane and carbon dioxide from the vast permafrost of Siberia is approaching. In fact, it's already starting to be released, driven by temperature rise in the Arctic, which at close to 4 degrees is some 3 or 4 times higher than the global average warming. Overall, the effectiveness of natural sinks at removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere has declined by about 5% over the last 50 years, and the decline is expected to continue. So more and more of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will stay in the atmosphere rather than being absorbed by land and ocean sinks. The presence of these climate carbon cycle feedbacks means that we have to reduce our direct emissions by more than we would need to if we had to contend only with the direct effects of our carbon emissions. In fact, the IPCC estimates that in order to stabilise greenhouse gases at a concentration of, say, 450 parts per million, the presence of carbon cycle feedbacks means that we'll have to reduce our total emissions over the 21st century by 27% more than we would otherwise in the absence of these climate carbon cycle feedbacks. Most leading climate scientists, and this was confirmed to me at a conference of climate scientists 2 weeks ago in Oxford, most climate scientists now believe that 2 degrees of warming would pose a substantial risk, both because of its direct impacts on climatically sensitive Earth systems and because of the potential to trigger irreversible changes in those systems. The latter irreversible changes include the disappearance of Arctic summer sea ice, and you can see from this chart here the level of warming along the bottom axis and the, well, forget the probability distribution. If you just look at this light blue line, you can see that Arctic summer sea ice is expected to disappear completely once warming reaches about 1.5 degrees. Already we've got 0.7, and we're committed to another 0.7 or 0.8, so 1.5 degrees is wholly unavoidable. Once you get up to 2 degrees of warming, and most climate scientists think that that's unavoidable, then you've got other tipping points coming into play: the melting of the Himalayan Tibetan glaciers, the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, and as things warm up to 3 degrees or more, you've got the collapse of the Amazon rainforest, shifts in the El Nino, and then things get super scary when you're talking about disruption of the thermohaline circulation and the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. The relationship, incidentally, this chart comes from Ramanathan and Feng, whose paper argued that we are already, as a result of past activities, committed to 2.4 degrees of warming. There's nothing we can do to stop that, which would take us past 3 of those critical tipping points. So that's going to happen, they believe, irrespective of what we do now. Despite that, James Hansen, one of the world's foremost climate scientists, has declared the goal of keeping warming at 2 degrees a recipe for global disaster. He believes the safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere is no more than 350 parts per million, whereas 2 degrees is associated with 450 parts per million. The current level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 385 parts per million. So Hansen is saying we have to get back down well below the level we're at now. And the only way we can do that is by finding some method, some technology to somehow extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, draw it down and dispose of it in a safe and permanent way. Technologies that don't exist. Despite these serious doubts about 2 degrees and its implications, let's ask ourselves whether aiming to limit warming to 2 degrees is a feasible goal. What do we have to do to stop emissions pushing temperatures above this level? Well, as you remember, just before the Bali Climate Change Conference a year ago, at the end of 2008, climate scientists released a new assessment arguing that in order to have a good chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees centigrade, rich countries like Australia must reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 25 to 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2020. And the 25% target quickly became entrenched as the global standard or benchmark by which the commitment of rich countries would be judged. And of course, rich countries, with the possible exception of Europe, have fallen far short of that. The fact that aiming for 25% instead of 40%, the upper end of the range, means that developing countries will have to do a lot more. That fact was conveniently passed over in the debate. Well, we've seen that rather than declining or even growing more slowly, global emissions have been accelerating over the last decade. To have any hope of avoiding catastrophe, global emissions must peak within the next few years, and certainly no later than 2020, and then begin a rapid decline to the point where all energy generation and industrial processes are completely carbon-free. James Hansen has put it very bluntly. He wrote, "Decision makers do not appreciate the gravity of the situation. Continued growth of greenhouse gas emissions for just another decade practically eliminates the possibility of near-term return of atmospheric composition beneath the tipping level for catastrophic effects." And meeting in March of this year, the world's leading climate scientists reached a similar conclusion. In their report, they wrote, "Immediate and dramatic emission reductions of all greenhouse gases are needed if the 2-degree guardrail is to be respected." So the urgent question we now have to ask ourselves is whether the global community is capable of cutting emissions at the speed required to avoid the Earth passing a point of no return, beyond which the future will be taken out of our hands. And it's this irreversibility that makes global warming not simply unique amongst environmental problems, but unique among all of the problems humanity has faced. Beyond a certain point, it will not be possible to change our behaviour to control climate change, no matter how resolved we are to do so. Well, if global emissions must reach a peak within 5 to 10 years, then decline rapidly until the world's energy systems are all but decarbonised, are the institutions of government in the major nations of the world capable of responding in time? And are international institutions capable of agreeing on a global plan that's adequate to the task? These are questions on which climate scientists have little useful to say. They're in the domain of political and behavioural scientists. However, confidence in the ability of humans to respond with the required urgency is dashed when we understand fully how near we are to the point of no return, a point to which I will now turn. Now, climate scientists have recently changed the way they think about the task ahead of us. They've adopted the so-called budget approach to describing what we must do. Because, as I've said, carbon dioxide persists in the atmosphere for a very long time, it's cumulative emissions that matter. So the total amount of carbon emissions humans put into the atmosphere over the next decades will determine our fate. A tonne of carbon emitted today counts as much as one emitted in 2050. So setting targets such as an 80% cut in 2050, which could be attained by any number of trajectories, is misleading and potentially very dangerous. Now, in a paper to a meeting of the Royal Society last year, Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes from the UK's Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, one of the top such centres, used this budget approach to set out the situation in the most striking and alarming way. There are two ways of thinking about the task. First, we can set a particular target, such as stabilising emissions at 450 parts, stabilising concentrations at 450 parts per million, and then calculate how soon global emissions must peak and how quickly they have to fall in order to meet that objective of, say, 450 parts per million. Then we must ask whether the path so defined is politically possible, given the national and international institutions which must mandate the changes to put us on that path. That's one way of thinking about it. Alternatively, we can make the most hopeful judgments about the emissions reduction path the world is likely to follow, and then ask where we end up. How much warming will that entail under the most optimistic set of assumptions? Well, Anderson and Bose analysed the task in both of these ways, but here I want to focus on the second approach. In other words, and this is based very closely on the Anderson and Bose paper, what I'm about to say in this segment of the talk. So we're going to make some optimistic assumptions about how soon and how quickly emissions can be reduced over this century and see what sort of a world we'll be left with. Well, there are three broad types of activity that determine the volume of greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere. The first is emissions of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels for energy and industrial processes. The second is carbon dioxide again from cutting and burning forests. And the third is non-CO2 greenhouse gases, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, the way Anderson and Bose go about it is they first make some simple assumptions, simple but plausible assumptions, about what we can expect from these second two, carbon dioxide from forested areas and non-CO2 gases, mainly from agriculture. And then having made these assumptions, because these sources are less important, we can then focus our attention on the big one, carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels and in industrial processes. Well, let's quickly deal with the second and third of these. Let's look at deforestation. Well, deforestation currently accounts for around 12 to 25% of the world's annual anthropogenic or human-induced carbon dioxide emissions. Reducing deforestation rates will need to be a major focus of efforts globally to minimise climate change. If the world's decision makers adopt a resolute attitude to tackling climate change, then an optimistic assumption about deforestation would be that the rate of deforestation peaks in 2015, 5 years, and that rate falls rapidly thereafter to around half their current levels by 2040 and to zero deforestation by 2060. And in that circumstance, deforestation in this century will add only 213 billion tonnes of CO2 to the atmosphere. What about non-CO2 gases? Well, these are mainly methane and nitrous oxide, and they accounted in 2000 for about 23% of total global greenhouse gas emissions in terms of their effect, their global warming potential. They mostly emitted from agriculture, methane from livestock and rice cultivation, and nitrous oxide from the use of fertilisers. Emissions from agriculture are growing rapidly as more land is turned over to crops and to pasture, and diets shift to the consumption of more meat as people in countries such as China become better off. Now, population growth will make the task of reducing non-CO2 emissions harder because, of course, food is the first item of consumption that people must have. Like emissions from deforestation, agricultural emissions must peak soon, then decline. Unlike emissions from deforestation, they can't be reduced to zero because of the nature of food production. If the world's leaders take resolute action, then an optimistic assumption would be that non-CO2 emissions will continue to rise until 2020, up from 9.5 billion tonnes in 2000 to 12.2 billion tonnes, and then fall to 7.5 billion tonnes or gigatons by 2050. So that 7.5 gigatons allocated to food production would be spread over a substantially bigger global population, which is expected to go from 6.6 to 9.2 billion by 2050, according to the UN. So the effect of that is that the emissions intensity of food production around the world must be reduced by 50% to stay within that 7.5 billion tonnes. Putting together these optimistic scenarios for deforestation and non-CO2 greenhouse gases gives us our floor, our basic bottom level that we can't get away with. Anderson and Bowes calculate the total cumulative emissions from these sectors over this century, bearing in mind that deforestation rate is assumed to fall to 0 in 2060, and emissions from agriculture expected to hit this floor of 7.5 billion tonnes by 2050. They calculate that because of these two, taken year on year, cumulative emissions from these sources over the rest of this century will amount to some 1,100 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that gives us our floor. Now we can turn our attention to the big one, carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels and for use in industrial processes. Well, when we start to think about this, two parameters are absolutely critical. The date at which global emissions reach their peak and the rate at which emissions fall thereafter. That will, you can think of a curve, the integral under the curve gives you the total emissions over the period. That's why it's called the budget approach. So these are two critical parameters, the date at the peak and the rate of emission reduction thereafter, will determine the total amount of greenhouse gases, along with these assumptions, the total amount of greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere over this century. And that in turn will determine the resulting increased concentration of greenhouse gases, which in turn will fix the amount of global temperature increase that follows. The later the peak year, the more rapidly emissions must fall to stay within any emissions budget you'd like to set. So, focusing on fossil carbon dioxide emissions, a very optimistic assumption is that global emissions will peak in 2020. Now, stopping global emissions growth will require from that year any increase in emissions from developing countries must be more than offset by a decline in emissions from rich countries like our own. An optimistic assessment of the prospects of an agreement at Copenhagen could see global emissions peak in 2020, although a more realistic date would be 2030. Nevertheless, if we assume that overall emissions growth can be halted in 2020, and here I'm talking about from our three sources, what rate of emissions reduction would be feasible in each year thereafter? This is really the critical question that virtually no one has posed, with one or two exceptions. How quickly can we possibly reduce at what rate can we possibly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? Well, there's some very helpful historical data contained in a much neglected box in the Stern Review. You can see these three historical examples. Economic collapse in the Soviet Union after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 led to a decline in its greenhouse gas emissions of 5.2% per annum for a decade. But in that period, the economic output of the Soviet Union collapsed, fell by half, with very widespread social misery. Half of its GDP disappeared. And it was that that drove down, of course, its greenhouse gas emissions. When France embarked on an aggressive program of building nuclear capacity in the late 1970s, from which point there was a 40-fold increase in 25 years in generation of nuclear energy, the annual emissions from the electricity and heat sector in France fell by 6% per annum, but total fossil emissions across all sectors of the economy fell by only 0.6%, less than 1%. In the 1990s, the dash for gas in Britain saw a large substitution of natural gas for coal in electricity generation. But total greenhouse gas emissions in Great Britain fell by 1% each year across the 1990s. Depressingly, Nicholas Stern concluded that reductions in emissions of more than 1% over an extended period, quote, have historically been associated only with economic recession or upheaval. Given that some world leaders recognise the severity of the threat posed by global warming, a couple of them do. Angela Merkel certainly does. I think the scientific advisors around Barack Obama understand just what's at stake. Kevin Rudd has no idea. But given that some do recognise the severity of the threat and the need, unprecedented, except in times of war, for a rapid structural change in economies, it might be reasonable, let's say, well, that's an optimistic assumption, to expect that the world could agree to reduce emissions by 3% per annum after the 2020 peak. So let's be very optimistic and say, well, some leaders recognise that this is an extremely urgent situation. Let's assume they're going to introduce policies that would see a rate of emissions reduction of 3% per annum. I might note, incidentally, that the Treasury's analysis of the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme sees no actual reduction in Australia's emissions until 2040. So Australia has a long way to go. But let's say the world makes this decision one way or another. So that global emissions are reduced by 3% per annum after 2020 until they reach this floor of 7.5 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent set by the need to feed the world. Well, Anderson and Bose in their analysis show that because of the assumptions they've made about rates of reduction for deforestation and rates of reduction for emissions from agriculture, a 3% decline in total global emissions will actually require a 3.5 or 4% rate of decline in carbon dioxide emissions from energy and industrial processes. In other words, deforestation and greater emissions efficiency within food production decline a bit more slowly than 3%. So that means that carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels and industrial processes have to decline at a rate that's a little bit faster. However, since emissions in developing countries could be expected to continue to grow, albeit at a slower rate, for some time after 2020, before peaking and beginning to fall, emissions reductions in rich countries under this global 3% emission reduction target will need to be a lot higher. They'll actually need to be somewhere around 6 to 7% per annum, higher than occurred in Russia during the 1990s, if we are to meet this global 3% emission reduction target. Okay, are you with me? Well, it's hard to imagine even the most concerned and active government, Sweden's maybe, introducing policies that would bring about such a rapid industrial restructuring. Nevertheless, let's put aside these doubts and put ourselves in the most optimistic frame of mind we can. If global emissions do peak in 2020 and then decline by 3% globally each year, with energy emissions in rich countries falling by 6 or 7% per year, could we, under those optimistic assumptions, head off the worst effects of climate change or even keep within the 2 degrees safe levels? Well, Anderson and Bose provide us with the answer, and this has been backed by at least 3 other analyses by other groups, which I'll mention in a moment. And the answer is a very grim one indeed. If that's the path taken by the world, then over the century, we, humans, will pump an extra 3,000 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which would not see atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases stabilise at a so-called safe level of 450 parts per million, nor would they stabilise at the very dangerous level of 550 parts per million. They would in fact rise to 650 parts per million. This is where you say, oh shit. Well, can this possibly be true? Here's the summary from Anderson and Bose, and you can see the relationship between the peaking year in the left-hand column, an assumed annual reduction rate for all emissions. Here's our bottom one that we just went through, peaking 2020, global emissions fall by 3%, annual reduction for energy and industrial emissions around about 3.5% to 4%. I haven't got it there, but 6 or 7% reduction rates for rich countries like us. That results, under those very optimistic assumptions, in atmospheric concentrations reaching 650 parts per million by the end of the century, and probably well before, associated with warming of 4 degrees centigrade, a degree of a level of warming that has not been experienced on this planet for 15 million years. Now, this analysis has been backed by subsequent reports. A recent report by the German Advisory Council on Global Change, the WGBU, assessed what it would take to have a good chance of remaining in the European target of 2 degrees, the so-called 2-degree guardrail. Well, to have a 2 out of 3 chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees, cumulative global emissions over the next 40 years would need to be kept below, 750 billion tonnes, with a small residual amount beyond 2050 for food production. And here are the charts they've done. The red one is shows you the 2020 peak, and then they bring it down sharply. The level, so under that curve, is the total emissions that would be the upper limit in order to keep warming under 2 degrees. And you can see that if we peak in 2020, then to limit warming to 2 degrees, then globally we have to reduce emissions by 9% per annum. It's completely inconceivable. The WGBU study concluded that even a delay in the peaking year to 2015 means global emissions have to fall at a rate of 5%. But if we go to 2020, they have this to say. This is a report which was delivered to Angela Merkel quite recently, a couple of months ago. And they write in the report, delaying the peak year even further to 2020, as in this red line here, could necessitate global emissions reduction rates of up to 9%. Reductions on an almost inconceivable scale, entailing technological feats and social sacrifices on a scale comparable to those of the Allied mobilisation during the Second World War. John Schellenhuber, who was at the conference in Oxford 2 weeks ago, he is the head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and was the lead author of the WGBU study. He referred to the areas under these curves that describe these carbon budgets as vicious integrals. Another study I'll refer to briefly by Mineshausen and others came to a similar conclusion, showing this very close relationship between the peaking year and the rates of emission reductions that have to follow if we are to keep within total emissions within 450 parts per million associated with 2 degrees of warming. And you can see that the way they analyse it, once you get beyond 2015, the only way you can stay within, in their view, 2 degrees is by, after about 2040, actually having negative emissions. So again, discovering some way, which we don't yet have, of sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in some safe form indefinitely. Well, it's clear that limiting warming to 2 degrees is completely beyond us. We're simply not going to do it. The question now is whether we can limit warming to 4 degrees. The conclusion that even if we act promptly and resolutely, the world is on a path to reach 650 parts per million with associated warming of 4 degrees is almost too frightening to accept. Yet that's the reluctant conclusion of the world's leading climate scientists, even with the most optimistic set of assumptions. The ending of deforestation, halving of emissions associated with food production, global emissions peaking in 2020 and falling at a rate of 3% a year for a few decades. Even with those assumptions, we have no chance of preventing emissions rising well above a number of critical tipping points that will spark uncontrollable climate change. The Earth seems to be locked on a path leading to a very different climate, a new and much less stable era lasting many centuries before natural processes eventually establish some sort of equilibrium. Whether human beings will still be a force on the planet, or even survive, is a moot point. These conclusions are alarming, to say the least, but they're not alarmist. Rather than choosing or interpreting numbers to make the situation appear worse than it could be, following Anderson and Bose, I've chosen numbers that err on the conservative side, that is, assumptions that reflect a more buoyant assessment of what is possible. A more neutral assessment would be even more pessimistic. Well, what does it all mean? Well, I don't plan to dwell on the likely impacts. I think you've probably scared enough, but I will just show you this so-called burning embers diagram, which was initially developed for the third assessment report, those 5 bars on the left-hand side, in 2001, but has been updated by climate scientists for this Copenhagen meeting that was held in March of this year, to indicate that climate science advanced to the point where the types of risks associated with, say, warming of 2 degrees, this 2-degree guardrail, which were assessed in 2001 as being, relatively low to moderate. You can see pale yellow getting a bit pink in that left-hand side one, that risk to unique and threatened species and systems. They've now put a lot more red and yellow in there. Basically, their greater understanding of climate systems and the impacts of 2-degree warming, let alone high levels of warming, have raised the risk thresholds very substantially indeed. So the significance of this diagram is twofold. On the one hand, scientists have now updated their assessment of the impacts under any degree of warming, such as 2 degrees, and said the risks of severe damage are now much higher than we previously believed. The other thing that's happened with the science is that back then in 2001, it was widely believed that with resolute action on the part of the international community, warming could be limited to 2 degrees. No one believes that anymore. So we've gone from the lower left-hand corner of this diagram. We're now firmly placed in the upper right-hand part of this diagram. If you look across, take your eye from 4 degrees across, you can see that all 5 of those are in the red zone, which means very high risk indeed. Now, these facts must cause us to rethink entirely how the future will play out. I've spent the last year thinking about that in preparing and writing this book, Requiem for a Species, which comes out in March, and I have to tell you, it's been one of the most depressing years I've ever spent. So we have to really rethink, we have to reconceptualise the future of planet Earth and of our societies and of our own selves and that of our children and grandchildren. There are 3, this analysis of Anderson, Bose and the other climate analysis groups cause us to question some of the most fundamental assumptions of the whole climate debate, and particularly the climate change negotiations, which will reach another crescendo in Copenhagen in December. What are those assumptions that are challenged? And this is the last few minutes of my talk. The belief that we can stabilise the climate at a specified concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere with an associated increase in global temperature rests on assumptions that are really not well founded in the science. The problem is that global warming is likely to trigger its own natural sources of new emissions and interfere with the Earth's capacity to remove carbon from the atmosphere. I've already mentioned the way in which natural sinks and the land have declined in their capacity to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the Earth's climate, unlike the models of the economists and the models on which most of our political leaders and climate negotiators operate, the Earth's climate is not like a machine whose temperature can be regulated by twiddling some policy knobs. It's a highly complex system with its own regulatory mechanisms. Some of the relationships among the variables are non-linear, so that a slight increase in warming can cause a very large shift in some other aspect of the climate. We're seeing this with the melting of the Arctic summer sea ice. Now, paleoclimatologists have known this for a long time. It's only in the last few years that this idea has been linked explicitly to today's global warming and the types of targets we need to set. If we look, imagine a chart showing the climate history of the Earth stretching back over millennia, like the one I showed earlier in the talk, we don't see smooth transitions from ice ages to interglacial or warm periods, such as the one we're in now. The transitions are sometimes dramatic, with sharp changes in the world's climate occurring sometimes over a few decades, probably due to amplifying feedback effects. So climate states can end abruptly once certain thresholds are crossed, setting off accelerated warming that's stopped only when some natural limit is reached, such as the disappearance of ice from Earth, which has happened in the past and, truth to tell, will probably happen again this century. All ice. That's not true. The melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet in Greenland, once it started, will be unstoppable, but it will take a couple of centuries to melt fully, it's believed. Well, after their 2008 review of the dangers of climate tipping points, a group of leading climate scientists, this is a paper Lentum et al., widely cited, they wrote, "Society may be lulled into a false sense of security by smooth projections of global change. The extent to which policymakers and their advisors have been lulled into a false sense of security is apparent from the sudden emergence of overshooting strategies, now adopted explicitly or implicitly by almost every government in the world, including Britain's and Australia's. Overshooting was the strategy recommended in both the Stern Review and explicitly taken up by the Garnaut Report. And this is the view that 450 parts per million is what we should be aiming at, but it's too hard politically, so we have to accept 550, and then we'll bring things down to 450 later on. Well, faith in our ability to overshoot, then return to a safer climate, simply fails to understand the science. Whatever we do, we'll be stuck with the results for a very long time. If carbon dioxide concentrations reach 550 parts per million, associated with warming of about 3 degrees, after which emissions fell to zero, the global temperature would continue to rise for at least another century, even if emissions fell to zero in 1 year, and that was it, because of the persistence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for a very long time. Moreover, once we reach 550 parts per million, a number of tipping points would have crossed. Think back to that other diagram that I showed you, 3 degrees. You cross 3 or 4 of those critical tipping points, so that all the efforts that humans then make to cut their emissions may be overwhelmed by so-called natural sources of greenhouse gases. In that case, rather than stabilising at 550 parts per million, 550 will just be a level we pass through 1 year on a trajectory to who knows where, 1,000 parts per million perhaps. The new understanding of the climate system and the likely influence of tipping points induced by human intervention also forces us to reconsider one of the other foundations of international negotiations and national policy approaches. Underlying, and that is the belief in our ability to adapt. Underlying discussion of adaptation is an unspoken belief that because global warming will change things slowly, predictably and manageably, we, in rich countries at least, will be able to adapt in a way that broadly preserves our way of life. Wealthy countries can easily afford to build flood defences to shield roads and shopping centres, and they can even put piles of boulders on Belongil Beach and keep the sea at bay. We can climate-proof our homes to shield ourselves from frequent heat waves. Yet if our belief in our ability to stabilise the Earth's climate is misconceived, then so is our belief in our ability to adapt easily to climate change. If instead of a smooth transition to a new, albeit less pleasant climate, warming sets off runaway processes, adaptation will be a never-ending labour. If warming rises above 3 or 4 degrees, the chances of severe and abrupt change the chances become high. A harsh and prolonged drought, as we know, can wipe out an entire region's food production. Fertile plains can be turned into dust bowls. a week of temperatures above 40 degrees can kill tens of thousands of people, as it did in France in 2003. Of course, for people in poor countries, adaptation means something entirely different. The effects of warming will be more cruel, and their ability to adapt is much more limited. In sum, the most important assumptions on which international negotiations and national policies are founded, that we can stabilise the climate at some level, that overshooting and returning to a lower target is feasible, and that we can accommodate 2 or more degrees of warming by adapting to it, these have no foundation in the way the Earth's climate system actually behaves. When one understands these facts, the state of political debate around the world takes on an air of unreality. Rich country policies, such as cutting emissions by a few percent and outsourcing most of the cuts to developing countries, waiting for carbon capture and storage technology to save the coal industry and continuing to pollute at high levels until that happens, planning the construction of new coal-fired power plants, and something even I couldn't believe, I read in the paper on the weekend, a proposal to export brown coal. These policies are so at odds with the scale and urgency of the emission cuts demanded by the science as to be almost laughable. They reflect a childlike belief that climate change can be averted by ignoring the truth and hoping for the best, a form of wishful thinking whose costs will prove incalculable. We moderns have become accustomed to the idea that we can modify the environment to suit our needs. And we've acted accordingly for some 300 years. We're now discovering that our intoxicating belief that we can conquer all has come up against a greater force, the Earth itself. We're discovering that humans cannot regulate the climate regulates us. The prospect of runaway climate change challenges our technological hubris and our enlightenment faith in reason. The Earth may soon demonstrate that ultimately it cannot be tamed, and that the human urge to master nature has only roused a slumbering beast. Thank you.
Probably the only thing I'd question is you said a few times that at some level we're depending on some way that can take carbon directly out of the atmosphere, okay, and that thing doesn't exist. Well, I mean, it's the process that actually put most of the carbon down in the first place, which is photosynthesis and biology and that aspect of it. So in terms of the debate with agriculture and specifically seasonally dry grasslands, the numbers that we've got from Peter Grace at QUT, Keith Bastian from Colorado, and the general collection of numbers is about 2 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare per annum under change management, and it's 3.8 billion hectares to 4 billion hectares globally. So there is a capacity to make a huge difference there with change management. That's one of the few things that can have an impact almost immediately, and that's just a piece of the debate that's missing. So I was just, in terms of the numbers you're talking about, I don't dispute the rest of it. I agree with a whole heap of that stuff, but the biology side of this, and specifically grasslands, has been omitted from the debate up until now. It's starting to get traction, and the terrestrial carbon group, etc. Copenhagen is likely to get some progress. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
There is opportunity to extract some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through change practices. I mean, we've already taken account of forests, but other land management practices. If we can find the land that can be converted into alternative, more carbon-rich uses, it's a one-off benefit. You know, once you convert, unless you find some way of taking the captured carbon in the form of vegetation and storing it underground permanently, because one way or another, once you've got the one-off benefit, you know, you go through rotations whereby you regrow and the stored carbon is released back into the atmosphere. So you get a one-off benefit, and it could be substantial. I'd like to see it.
What do you mean by one-off?
Well, if you've got a, say, let's talk trees, because it's sort of easier to conceptualise.
Not trees. Trees I agree is one-off, not specifically trees, it's the grasslands. So from a grazing point of view, carbon levels in the soil have probably dropped from 5 and 6% down to 1s. Yeah. Okay, so there's capacity that the 2 tonnes per hectare, the estimates are 30, 40, 50 years as a cumulative factor. Okay, so this is a process, yes. An ongoing natural process that builds and builds and builds.
Yeah, but there's a limit to it.
Yeah, but on 4 billion hectares at 2 tonnes per annum for the next 50 years is a fair chunk of what we're talking about up there.
How many tonnes do you reckon?
2 tonnes per hectare per annum is a number. Keith Bastian was one of the IPCC lead authors on soils.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's got, his figures are 3.8 billion hectares, so you've got about 7 billion tonnes per annum, and 30 to 50 years consecutive, because there's been a huge decline over the last, well, since we turned up on the planet. So in terms of we're not talking about taking grasslands or lands and putting them under forestry, we're not taking them out of production, it's changing the way they're managed, yep. And getting that cumulative impact.
So you're enhancing the carbon store of soils.
Correct.
Talking about, and your estimate is that the transformation of management practices could permanently enrich the carbon store over a very wide expanse of land, yep. And permanently sequester a large part of the carbon that we're putting in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'd love to see a paper that made those estimates. I know I'm very sceptical. Well, I'm reasonably sceptical, I should say. I mean, I think the biochar people have grossly oversold. It's not biochar, I take your point. But for someone who's been involved in climate change policy and analysis for some 15 years, you know, you do tend to get a little bit cynical or sceptical about, you know, one magic solution after another. And as soon as, you know, people put them forward, they look great. And then over the next couple of years, the experts start to deconstruct and they say, well, you know, it might make a bit of a difference, but it's really been oversold. So, but and I also correspond with Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes about that as well.
Clive, thanks very much for the talk. A couple of numbers that I'd just like to look at. The Stern Review box covering the French reduction of 0.6% is, of course, through nuclear programme, is, of course, a country figure and doesn't include the processing of yellow cake and the net increase in emissions through nuclear fuel processing in other countries. And of course, when we're looking at global carbon net emissions, we have to count all the countries. You talked about, or you referred briefly to systemic failure, the political failure.
Yes.
What possibly do those new systems look like? How do they start to take shape? Because, you know, we're seeing direct action from young community groups now against coal infrastructure. We're seeing intergenerational equity issues. How do you think the political landscape and the political systems will change to accommodate what it was a horrific projection?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the situation we're in is in part a failure of the democratic process. We've seen a shift in the way political systems operate in countries like Australia, where there's little substantial difference between the two main political parties, and that means that money politics tends to play a much larger role, and there's the parties are then competing for some marginal advantage in the mind of the electorate. That means they don't have to take anything too seriously. It's all part of a sort of chess game. And so what this has meant is a greater cynicism in politics and a loss of commitment and passion. And that and we've seen this in an astonishing degree, the way this process works in Canberra over the last year, with the way in which the fossil fuel lobby has mobilised its resources in an extremely effective way to essentially neuter the Labor government's commitment to do something serious on climate change, and to see in the light of the sort of analysis that people like Anderson and Bowes have now done, to see Labor and the coalition at each other's throats over whether they should allocate 94.5% or 97% of revenue from emission permits to the polluters is, I mean, you could write a farce about it. I mean, it's so absurd. You just shake your head. So I think the only possible way is of really coming to grips with this is, given the widespread levels of denial, and I'm not talking about skeptics, I'm talking about the general public, and the techniques we use to refuse to face up to what the scientists are saying. I think we need a serious radicalisation of democratic politics and going outside of the traditional parliamentary forms, which have manifestly failed. So, for me, the only ray of light is the emergence of groups of young people in particular who've become, who are absolutely terrified. They know this, and they're absolutely terrified. And they're becoming more and more radical and more active, and good on them, because it's their future which we baby boomers have screwed up. And so I just hope it doesn't come too late. The truth is, I think it is too late.
Thank you for your talk. You quickly mentioned Sweden. Are there any particular policies, techniques, I guess, that are countries that are leading processes or any solutions that will, I guess, give us a light to maybe reducing sort of 4 degrees?
That's where we've got to. You know, which radical policies could we introduce that would achieve a 3% reduction in emissions, so that we try to aim for 4 degrees only? You know, unheard of for 15 million years. Well, certainly, I mean, some northern states of Germany, for instance, have 40% of their electricity generated by wind power. So, you know, a rapid shift to renewable energy is actually perfectly feasible. But you see, I think it's a bit of the wrong way around. I mean, I think it is like a wartime emergency. We just simply need to say, each major nation needs to say, we have to do this. We're just going to do it. And having done that, all sorts of things that are currently there will suddenly be mobilised, but also things that over the next few years that we can't foresee will suddenly come on stream as well. But of course, that means defeating the influence of the old energy industries. But there's a huge amount that can be done, there's no question about it. It does take time to transform an energy system, both its supply and the way it's used, but I reckon a crash course in 10 years. I mean, the United States and Britain completely transformed their economies in 12 or 18 months when they had to guarantee their survival at the outbreak of the Second World War. So it's doable, and that's the scale of it. The trouble is, there isn't an enemy amassing on the shores of Normandy ready to invade.
Thanks. I would just like to make a comment about the energy systems transformation. I mean, with peak oil peaking, I mean, that's one of the things that will surely cause energy systems to be transformed to a certain extent.
Well, it will if it happens. We've heard about peak oil for a very long time, but the economists are half right, at least, in that as oil becomes more scarce, oil companies will, of course, put more effort into finding new and previously uncommercial sources, and we're already seeing them going back to old oil fields to try and extract the stuff that was left behind. But probably the most worrying, of course, is oil extraction from tar sands, which big oil is now investing in heavily. Incidentally, Shell took out an ad saying that its extraction of oil from tar sands in Canada was a sustainable energy source. I mean, corporate spin doesn't get more cynical than that. So, I mean, I don't think peak oil is going to come, you know, in the next 10 or 20 years, and after the peak, you know, there will be probably a slow decline. So peak oil will come, but I think it's, we all wish it would come earlier, but we've been wishing that for quite a long time.
Clive, it's Philip Mitchell. Two questions, very quick ones, and they're much more simplistic, I think, than some of the more detailed stuff that you've been talking about. Firstly, Copenhagen. What actually needs to happen, and to what extent do you think that we can actually achieve anything at all out of it? Which is the first question. Secondly, not all scientists, as I understand it, are totally in agreement that the climate change problems are entirely man-made. Therefore, there's major argument even within the scientific division in relation to that. How do you argue that in relation to the causes that you're promoting without being seen to be simply a radical advocate?
Well, I'm not promoting a cause tonight. I'm telling you what the scientists are saying. And if I remember, I'll come back to Copenhagen, but really, if you believe that, I'm sorry, I'm going to be very rude to you. If you believe there's a serious scientific debate on this, then you've been duped. There is no serious scientific debate. There's a bunch of skeptics with few climate change qualifications who manufacture evidence, make outlandish claims. Plimer is a classic case. I mean, his book is full of distortions, misleading statements, and schoolboy howlers. And as soon as the serious climate scientists who have some credibility took the opportunity to read it, I mean, they would laugh at it if it weren't so serious. So these people, they don't have publications in the referee journals. I mean, if they did, and there was a series of them, people like me would be extremely happy. And the skeptics would win the Nobel Prize without doubt for saving humanity from a huge mistake. But they don't publish in peer-reviewed journals. And if you look at what they say, if you can be bothered, you'll find that virtually everything they say can be traced to skeptics' websites in the United States, funded directly or indirectly by the oil industry, Exxon in particular. So, you know, it's simply untrue. It is simply untrue to say that there is a significant level of scientific agreement about this. And yet, in the 1990s, when Exxon started to fund these think tanks, they got the best advice they could from PR companies, and they were told very explicitly, based deliberately on the experience from working with the tobacco companies, that the best way to head off action is to create doubt in the public mind. And the best way of creating doubt is to put up apparent experts who seem to be credible, who can say this is all wrong. Because people want not to believe it. I mean, who wouldn't want to reject this? It's much easier and more comfortable to say, oh, the scientists can't make up their mind, you know, I'll worry about it when they do. The skeptics are a small coterie of mostly unqualified people, or people who don't have recognised expertise in the climate science area, have been fantastically successful, often with the collaboration of the media, who traditionally feel they have to balance one view against the other. They've been fantastically successful at sowing doubt in the public mind when the climate scientists aren't in doubt. Of course, there are scientific uncertainties, but the basic propositions and broad thrust of climate science is not in dispute.
Copenhagen?
Copenhagen, it's very hard to know. If you look at the commitments of the major OECD countries and think about the 25% target as the minimum necessary, that is the emission reductions by 2020 over 1990 levels, to get somewhere near to limiting warming to 2 degrees, then the public commitments of the major nations, EU, Japan, US, Australia, I suppose, then it goes about halfway at the moment. goes about halfway towards that. Mind you, that's nearly all Europe, because they've said they'll go 30% if other nations commit to substantial cuts. The United States, it's about 4% on 1990, but a lot of offshore compliance. 5% in Australia, maybe higher, but there's so much wriggle room in the Rudd government's commitment that I don't expect it to be any higher than 5%, no matter what happens in Copenhagen. And of course, it does require developing countries to make commitments as well, not legally binding emission reduction targets, but certainly some firm undertaking to reduce the growth rate of their emissions one way or another, and their various schemes in hand for doing that. But the best we could possibly hope for out of Copenhagen would be some sort of international binding agreement that saw global emissions peak in 2020 and global emissions fall by 3% per annum thereafter, which, as Anderson and Bose show, will leave us with 4 degrees of warming. Of course, it's not 4 degrees of warming, because once you've got that amount, you've lost all control, and it'll be eventually beyond that.
Hi. You sounded a bit, or seemed, perhaps I misread it, but seemed a bit cynical about attempts like those of the UK government to set legislation that would introduce caps, the 34% cap by 2020 and 80% by 2050. Is that fair? And secondly, it seems that there's what you're saying is a lot about getting the message out and getting this message out. Do you want to talk about if there's a role for governments or other organisations or non-traditional ways of getting the message out about climate change?
Well, I mean, the UK government is perhaps the most advanced in the world in terms of its commitment to reducing emissions. The point about targets like 80% cut by 2050, I mean, they're actually meaningless. Anyone can say, any politician can say by 2050 we're going to do something. But legislated 2020 targets are, of course, a very different kettle of fish, and the UK has gone a long way down those lines. And the UK is really making some hard decisions, and if you're not meeting severe opposition, then you're not making hard decisions, and there has been quite a lot. I mean, they've fudged a lot as well on aviation, for example. It was only the other day that the new extension to Kings North Power Station was abandoned, the proposal for it, but not because the government banned it, but because E.ON, I think it was, said that they expected demand to be lower, so they weren't going to go ahead and build it. Far-reaching action is possible. The UK has, gone maybe halfway to where every nation needs to go. Political communication, well, this is a sort of endless source of debate, and I know when I say this and this book comes out, people say, oh, you mustn't say these things because people become fearful and they'll be immobilised and so on and so forth. Yeah. I mean, basically, I think we're way beyond that. It's like, if you imagine, and the only analogy I can think of, well, maybe the nuclear Holocaust analogy is a good one. Well, let's not tell people about, the possibility of a nuclear war, and, let's downplay the possible effects. It won't be, a nuclear winter. It'll just be a little bit of cooling for a few years. I mean, come on. This is really, really serious. And my view is that the problem is not the risk of people becoming too fearful. People aren't nearly fearful enough. They really don't get it. And because they don't want to get it. And because the sceptics have been successful in sowing doubt in their minds. So basically, I just think the only thing that will really have the prospect of getting people to respond with anything like what's needed is terror. And that's what the young people who are now forming groups like the Australian Youth Climate Coalition are running on. Pure fear. I mean, they are scared about their future, and it's that which is motivating them. And these ideas that, we need a positive message so it's more palatable, I mean, that's just marketing bullshit, We're not selling soap, we're saving the world, trying to. So I really think that climate scientists and climate activists have really got to muscle up. I mean, the climate scientists themselves, I've spoken to a lot of them, they're despairing, they're depressed, they're deeply worried about the future, including the future of their own families. And some of them feel very guilty. They feel as though they didn't ring the alarm bells loudly enough in the early years, and now no one's listening, or they're not listening enough. And if they'd rung the alarm bells more loudly years ago, then maybe we wouldn't got into this situation. I mean, I think they're too hard on themselves, but even so, you know, it's very, very scary.
I'm just wondering what could be done to save us all. Can you see any, you know, what changes in the political system rather than the science could, you know, what could be done, and what do you see as the political changes that could happen to bring that about? Maybe put us on a war footing, whatever you say. What would happen?
Well, I think you know, I've already talked about the groups of young climate activists who, you know, who I have great admiration for. But of course, it would help. In fact, it's necessary to have a sort of much broader coalition, and maybe the moratorium movement of the 60s and 70s is a good model. I mean, the reason it was so successful is that it was a broad coalition of groups from community groups, churches, trade unions, peace groups, women's groups, and so on. And they were united with a common, albeit simpler goal. And over a period of 5 to 10 years were very successful. So maybe that's the model of political action. I mean, clearly the current conventional forms of political activity of lobbying your local member and writing letters to them and the newspaper and so on haven't worked. They haven't gone nearly far enough in bringing about the sort of radical policies that we must now have. There was a very interesting paper published by WWF in the United Kingdom a few months ago by Tom Crompton and Tim Kasser, which took a very novel view of the psychology of climate change and the types of messaging that climate groups and others were using, and the potential counteractive, the way in which they're counteracting some of their messages by, for example, telling people, here are 10 things you can do in your home to save the climate. I mean, I actually think those sorts of messages do more harm than good for a couple of reasons. One is they're simply untrue. I mean, individuals acting alone, changing their light bulb or driving a Prius, whilst, you know, we all do it because we want to reduce our own sense of personal responsibility, they're simply not going to work. They haven't worked. And they won't work. This is a collective problem, not one individual one. The second reason is why it's counterproductive is that it reinforces the view that our problems are the result of our individual consumption behaviour, and therefore our solution should come out of our individual consumption behaviour. In other words, we can consume our way out of this mess. I don't think we can.
You say you're not selling soap, but has there been any attempt to mobilise these incredibly powerful, high-powered PR agencies on your side? I mean, is there any group that should get together to... On my side. I mean, I'm very concerned with the Requiem. I mean, I presume it's for us. And I was going to propose that instead of asking questions, we had a minute's silence to consider this. But why not take on PR people to put forward this message?
Yeah.
And why not engage television companies and film companies to create a series of films called 4 Degrees of Warming?
Yeah.
I mean, this is to get to people
Yeah.
through those means,
Yeah.
not governments. Governments, people don't trust government.
Yes. Well, there have been quite a lot of efforts. I mean, I myself set up the Climate Institute 4 years ago with a $10 million grant from a philanthropic trust with a view precisely to trying to mobilise these sorts of techniques to help shift public opinion. And it's not, so getting the best PR marketing people thinking about it, and it's not been entirely without success, but you can see from where we are now, given the woeful level of political debate that's going on, that it's still a very, very long way to go. There's a film out, which some people may have seen, I haven't seen it yet, called The Age of Stupid, which stars Pete Postlethwaite, who's sitting there in 2050, I believe, looking back in a world that's vastly transformed, looking back on people in the 20th century and trying to understand how they screwed up so badly. So people are using those sorts of innovative ways too of trying to communicate a message. I have actually seen a couple of films, documentary-style films on what a world would be like at 4 degrees, some very, very effective ones, but it's not the sort of thing vast numbers of people are going to want to go to the pictures on Friday night to watch.
But the film should star the young man who was in the vampire film, not Pete Postlethwaite.
Well, yes. Well, the message is sexy. I mean, Hollywood loves climate change, and you know, every respectable, Hollywood star under 40 drives a Prius and has jumped on the bandwagon and has appeared on the cover of Vanity Fair dressed in green imp clothing. They do it, but there's just a limit. You know, there's a resistance, and of course, you know, if the celebs do get involved, I mean, people might like it, but they're cynical as well, quite rightly. Because, you know, if you think of Bono, for example, I mean, it's hard to take him seriously on anything. So people are thinking about this, and they're putting a lot of effort into it, but, you know, the task is a really hard one, sadly.
Clive, has there been any attempt to engage any industry group other than the baddies of coal and oil? People in the energy business might be interested actually in developing more of the wind and the solar and all those alternative forms of energy generation. Has there, that you know of, been any attempt to do that?
Yeah, there have been very substantial mobilisations of some very big corporates. In banking, insurance, all sorts, even some of the energy companies. Gareth here actually is heavily involved in this and knows vastly more about it than I do. The ACF a few years ago did get together a group of very big organisations. What was the name of the coalition? Which was a pretty powerful force. But you know, in the end, it's some enlightened business people saying we really need to change this because we think this is the way of the future, up against some very determined fossil fuel industries who quite rightly see their future at stake. Their future is at stake. They should disappear for the next 10 years. Simple as that. And so they will fight tooth and nail. So, you know, for them, they are willing to sacrifice a lot to win the battle, whereas these other big companies aren't willing to sacrifice a lot. Just say, Gareth?
Actually, quick one. So I've worked in developing wind farms in Japanese, Australian companies. I commercialised CSRO's first clean tech company. I had the first international climate risk consulting firm looking at the risk end of climate change. I recently had dinner with the managing director of the world's dirtiest coal plant. And I find that it's very easy to be drawn into dogma and form polar views. And often what happens is we tend to demonize people. And having dinner with this managing director, he told me he'd looked at 58 clean tech technologies since January. So some companies are actually trying to do something about it, but some clearly are doing nothing about it. In Australia, we still lag behind on nearly every metric, and it's a difficult place. It's been expensive for me to work here on a number of levels. But we are starting to see new generations of technology coming through, new generations of people that have adaptive minds, adaptive thinking that can unlock themselves or detach themselves from the vested interests. And just one point in Copenhagen, I was in Bali briefing Rudd. I looked over his shoulder and there were the aluminium, coal and other interested parties. There wasn't one climate scientist in the government team, and there isn't one in Copenhagen. So don't expect a political process to follow any rational argument. That's a personal view, separated from my professional role.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, is there any sort of education program by educating, say, like our primary schools or secondary colleges, groups like De La Salle Brother groups or organisations or even universities? Can we educate our students? Is it too late for that?
Well, I mean, in a sense, anything we can do will be beneficial, because at a minimum we can delay some of this happening. So, I mean, it's not a question of giving up. We have to redouble our efforts, in my view. I actually know a bit about secondary schools and climate change education, because when I was at the Australia Institute, I left 18 months ago, but one of the last things we did while I was there, in the 6 months prior to that, was to develop a curriculum for different subject areas in secondary schools for years 9 and 11, I think, on various aspects of climate change science and policy. And there's a website where all of that material is now. I don't know whether it's been, because I'm not connected with the Institute anymore, but that was certainly promoted by some teaching services in the country, and indeed the Teachers' Union. So that was seen to be a valuable resource developed. I mean, we've got a lot of expert advice, of course, in developing that. So that's one thing you perhaps look at.
Thank you for what you said before. I'm wondering if, in light of all that, there's not a social challenge even more, even deeper and more scary than the scientific one, which is our or the global incapacity to generate enough urgency to tackle that. And I'm wondering if there's not, we should look towards maybe putting solutions in front of people, visioning different futures, challenging the energy companies to put sort of prototypes in front of people and tell people, well, if you do this, this sort of future is possible, rather than if we fight the coal miners or and so on.
Well, a lot of people have done a lot of work over the years trying to develop sort of positive futures. And I actually believe that, had we got onto it earlier, that over a 20-year period we could have radically transformed our energy economies, headed off the worst of climate change, and actually had better, more comfortable lives. Because a lot of the energy technologies, alternative energy technologies, have all sorts of benefits other than reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Just think of transport systems, for example, and building houses that are more energy efficient. They're not just more energy efficient, they're actually more comfortable to live in. All sorts of things like that. So quite a lot of thinking and work has gone into that. And there's plenty of that around. And it's very persuasive if you accept that there's a problem that we have to tackle. But there's one issue I haven't talked about, which I do develop quite a lot in the book, and that is our astonishing preoccupation with economic growth. The truth is, whatever technologies that we develop and implement, they're going to have to run really, really hard just to keep up, or just to offset the effects of economic growth. If you look at, I did a study that was published in Energy Policy a few years ago that looked at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions growth in OECD countries. And let me try and get the figures right here, they're fairly simple numbers. But greenhouse gas emissions in OECD countries increased by, over this period, a sort of 20-year period, by 10%, they were driven up partly by population growth, but overwhelmingly by economic growth, that's higher incomes, and technology, which had been quite effective, could offset about half of it, half of the total growth, but nevertheless left you with continued growth of it. And if you look at what China's doing, I mean, China is actually very, very worried about climate change. They know that they're in very deep trouble. I mean, they're going to have horrible droughts in northern China, and they're very worried about social unrest, and sea level rise is a massive potential problem in a few decades' time. And so China has actually now embarked on a program. It's only emerged in the last few months, or knowledge of it in the West has only emerged in the last few months. They're going to dominate the global market for renewable energy. They're taking over the wind power industry. They're taking over the solar, various forms of solar power, and they're going to drive it, firstly, by domestic use. They will mandate a massive increase in wind power, for example. They've bought the technology, they'll refine it, and they'll be exporting wind turbines and nacelles and so on to Northern Europe in a decade, don't you think, Gareth? So they're very, very serious about it. But the growth of the economy is so massive that even though they've got these huge programs of promoting renewable energy, their emissions are going to easily double in the next 20 years, even with all that. So growth is a massive, massive problem. But, you know, I wouldn't tell China it should grow more slowly, but I'd certainly say in Australia we should grow more slowly, or even shrink.
I'm concerned about time. Two more questions, I think, then we're going to have to wrap up. So one here and one over there.
I just had more of a comment. I wanted to answer your question. Speaking from my background, which is an educational one, I think, you know, to answer your question, students are incredibly interested in this, and environmental science is one of the subjects that has really gone through the roof as opposed to a lot of the other sciences. More and more students are undertaking it. And it's one of those issues. I don't know a school that I go into that doesn't have an environmental club, which is, you know, one of the most popular clubs in the schools. I don't know how effective it is, whatever they're doing, but it's certainly a real topic of interest.
And final.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, do you feel these corporate organizations and government organizations are fooling around with minds of people? Like changing a bulb or driving less? Like, it's not the normal consumption of human beings. Like, the changes they make will surely contribute to lower the emissions, but the major contributors are the corporate organization and the industries. And I seriously feel that if there is enough education in layman's language, like what I learned from today, do you think, like, if everybody, the general public, will be informed about it, it will put pressure on the industries and the government to create some policies and reduce the carbon emissions of the footprint?
Yes, indeed. I think it's the only way. The corporate interests have been very, very influential in shaping the terms of this debate. I mean, we see it constantly in Parliament. You know, the relentless emphasis on jobs. Actually, the lies told are absolutely astonishing. I mean, if you listen to the National Party or the Australian Coal Association, you'd think that the Rudd government's very weak CPRS is going to lead to massive job losses in areas heavily dependent on coal or burning coal. In fact, all of their analysis shows that there would not be one job lost. What the analysis shows is that jobs would not grow as rapidly, and yet they're out there saying this will devastate jobs and lead to massive unemployment. Well, you know, there ought to be some truth in politics thing where you cross some line and you just can't tell lies like that.
So why aren't there counter ads on the television, like we see the coal association advertising about the job loss, but
Yeah.
we don't see any counter ads from.
No, that's true. There's a distinct imbalance. I mean, the government, the Rudd government, was going to have a series of ads to raise public awareness of climate change and its risks. And in fact, they did put some on in the early months, and they were really hopeless, you know, and they just, there's no another ad, you know, climate change, drought, whatever, what's on the other channel. So really they didn't cut through. But I think your point about green consumerism is a very strong one. I mean, look, we've had for at least 10 years a very sustained campaign by the electricity retailers to persuade people to buy green energy, renewable-based energy. The take-up rate amongst households after all that effort is about 9% in Australia. So appealing to people's financial interests or good conscience to behave in a way to behave as consumers is really, as I said, counterproductive, because it shifts responsibility from the corporations and government onto the shoulders of individual consumers. And so the promotion of these schemes, change your light bulb and whatever, I think is a way of those who can really solve this avoiding responsibility for it. And what it does is it reinforces the impact of the neoliberal revolution, if I can call it that we've had over the last 25, 30 years, and the tremendous emphasis on individuals and individual action, and people expressing their preferences through their consumption behaviour rather than through their ballot box behaviour. There's a huge amount of evidence to show now that people behave in very different ways. It's not inconsistent to fail to ring up your retailer and get green energy, on the one hand, but to vote for a government that will mandate that everybody has to have green energy. I mean, people do that all the time. I mean, probably not too many people would pay their taxes voluntarily, but if everybody has to pay their taxes and people believe that everyone's paying a reasonably fair share, and then most people are pretty happy to pay their tax. So, I think in a way we're a victim of this huge shift over the last 30 years away from collective forms of action through political activity and the emphasis on consumer behaviour and individuals.